location in northeast Thailand, and this is where the spirit houses which are around, which people have at their homes for any local spirits, ancestor spirits or spirits of the place to go and be in, and therefore not annoy people in their homes. They're an important thing in this part of the world. But here, sometimes once they're broken or they need to be discarded, what do you do with them? Because they might still have spirits and things associated with them. So they come to these, they're placed in these special places where all of the broken spirit houses live. So anyway, this is just a little bit of an introduction. We're going to talk a bit about the history of archaeology today, and there's a nice theme of time, that's a big part of it, and also about the complexity of human activities, the fact that humans don't always do things always for practical or obviously practical purposes. So we're going to start off by thinking about who were the first archaeologists in the world. So you'll have noticed that we've shifted location now. We're back in the town of Phimai, and this is which gate is this? North. This is the western gate of the old town of Phimai. So Phimai, which was once called Phimai and was an important regional capital for the Khmer Empire. So anyway, that's where we are. But moving on, thinking about the first archaeologists, and keeping in mind that idea of a theme of time. So the first archaeologists, it depends on where you are in the world, what you're talking about. But here's an example from China, the Liangzhu culture jade. So Liangzhu was an early culture in the coastal parts of China, southern China. These wonderful jade artifacts were made and buried about 4,500 years ago, and then they were excavated and reused by the Shang dynasty around 3,000 years ago. So 1,500 years after they were made and used initially, they were then re-excavated and used by a later culture. So it's a form of archaeology. It's a rediscovery, a reanalysis of ancient materials. So you can find examples all around the old world of people finding, reusing, digging up stuff from the past. So in this little sort of diagram I've got here on the next page, you can see that we're starting to talk about these ancient civilizations. They had some form of archaeology. But then we get to the 16th, 17th century antiquarians in Europe and England in particular, but throughout Europe. So that was kind of like the beginning of archaeology as a modern tradition. The sort of tradition that archaeologists today might hark back to begins, I guess, with the antiquarians. So these are people who had plenty of money and plenty of time, and they were interested in digging up land on their estates and discovering old things from there and making collections of those old things. One of the most important outcomes of this antiquarian interest was the idea of a three-age system. So can you think of what the three ages of the three-age system are? You've probably heard of them before. Think about it for a second. I'm going to tell you in 20 seconds, so you got 20 seconds to think about it. But Thompson in Europe came up with this idea of a three-age system in 1816. Now, what sort of time period are we talking about for the time depth that all these? How far back does human activity go? How far back should we be looking for the beginnings of early society, human society? Well, in the 19th century, or beginning of the 19th century at least, and a little time before that, 4004 BC was often thought of by sort of calculating times, lifespans and times of death and stuff like that. Going back through the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, people came to the idea that 4004 BC might have been the time when the earth was created. So initially we've got these ancient civilizations, we've got this Christian world developing, we've got antiquarians coming about, and then they're seeing that there is old stuff around, and they're trying to cram it all into this 4004 BC, so 6,000 and a bit years ago, for the beginning of the creation of the universe, of the earth, humanity. Okay, so we go to the next picture, and we can see that the three ages were in fact the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. So that was the first effort by these antiquarians digging up stuff from these places around England, around Europe, and noticing that you got some sites that just had stone stuff in them. You got some sites which had some bronze technology, things made from bronze but no iron. And then you other sites which had iron, things made from iron as well as from bronze, and probably some stone stuff as well. So by logically ordering that sort of stuff, it made sense that there must be an earlier Stone Age. That was the first technology. Then later on, bronze, the first metals were developed, so that was the next technology that was developed, and then the Iron Age came after all that. And again, how long a time span does that cover? No idea, but perhaps all within that potential starting date of 4004 BC. During the 19th century, Charles Darwin came along, and with his theory of evolution started to sort of add a little bit more nuance to all these ideas. So clearly things must be changing over time. If evolution happened, did it all happen within 6,000 years? I don't know. So this was all by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, there's lots of new ideas starting to bubble around. And just to remind you, the 19th century is the 1800s. The 20th century is the 1900s. We're now in the 21st century, or the 2000s. Okay, so going on down to the next picture, so start to build out this table kind of around the history of archaeology. So Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, so the idea that things did change over time. Bursche de Perth and Charles Lyell started to talk about ideas around extinct animals. They realised when you looked into geological locations and you dug up stuff from the past, you found bones of animals that are no longer present, that aren't on the earth anymore. Where did they come from? What happened to them? And also that some of those extinct animals might have been associated with stone tools. So again, pushing things back into the past. So these sorts of ideas are bubbling around and thinking, well, there must be some sort of reasonable time depth going on here. John Lubbock talked about the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. So not only was there a Stone Age, but you could divide the Stone Age into at least two different parts. So the Paleolithic being the older Stone Age, the simpler stone tools, and the Neolithic is neo meaning new and lithic meaning stone. So the Neolithic essentially getting polished stone tools. So that's when you get a piece of stone, you hit it and you shape it by knocking little flakes off of it, get the right shape that you want, and then to refine it, you grind it against maybe some sandstone or something like that to get a beautiful, smooth surface and a much more refined shape. So that's the Neolithic. So Lubbock, by looking at what was found in different archaeological sites, could see that there was an earlier Paleolithic, an old Stone Age, and then a later Neolithic. So with all of these ideas bubbling around, there seemed to be some sort of an idea that there must be something called deep time, that humans had actually been around for a long period of time, that history was changing over a long period of time, and maybe 4004 BC was not long enough for all of this change, all of these different things to have happened in. So here's some other examples. So the history of archaeology, we have the Sumerians, also interested in their past. So they're back in the first millennium BC, and then the Greeks were also interested in their past as well. Understanding the past was important for many societies, simply because it was important to, once you have early kings and kingdoms coming about, it's important to be able to legitimize your authority. So we'll come back to this later on in the semester, but it's an important one way of legitimizing your authority, of saying, yes, I have a right to be king, to be ruler, is to demonstrate your connection to the past. So a bit of archaeology, a bit of an understanding of history was important from the earliest state societies, because it was important for them, for their leaders, to be able to demonstrate their connection, their legitimacy for ruling over people, because they have the connection to the past, to the ancestors. Shang Dynasty China, as we talked about before, the excavation and reuse of Liangzhu jades from earlier time periods. So then we come back to this idea of the antiquarians. These days we might call antiquarians looters. It's a great tradition of England and Europe in particular, but particularly in England, of detectorists, people out there with the metal detectoring tools, looking for hoards of Roman gold and things like that. So those antiquarians and metal detectorists are somewhat related. And out of that, as I've said before, we got the idea of the 3-age system. So people started collecting all these things and putting them together. We had the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, as I said, and C.J. Thompson of Denmark in 1836 in a guide to northern antiquities. He was the guy who put together this 3-age system. And then later on, the Stone Age in particular was broken up into the Paleolithic, so the Old Stone Age, the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and in between them, the Mesolithic, which I'm sure you can guess means the Middle Stone Age. So there's the beginning of sort of dividing up all these time periods into different subsections. Geologists were important in understanding all this kind of history. So James Hutton, with the theory of the Earth in 1785, he came up with this idea of stratification. So geologically, you can see layers of rock and sediments that have been built up over thousands of years, and that same idea of stratification is important in archaeology as well. So even over smaller time periods, when humans live in a place, they build up, or they can build up layers again as well in the same sort of way. So it's the same processes, and the geology help to establish that idea of layers, stratification, things happening over time and being recorded geologically or physically. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and the Principles of Geology in 1833 came up with the idea of uniformitarianism. So this means that the same sort of processes that we observe around us today were probably happening in the past as well. So, erosion from rivers cutting down through the soil. The fact of as you throw rubbish out at your back door, you sort of build up a layer of soil behind your house, and then you might build a new house on top of that, and then you get these layers building up. So uniformitarianism is simply the idea that the processes that we see around us today have probably been going on in the past, and so we can kind of interpret what we see in the soil based on our experience of what we do or what we see around us in more recent times. So uniformitarianism. And Jacques Boucher-de-Peur, also looking at the idea of stone tools associated with extinct animals. So our ancestors, sometime in the past, were around and using these stone tools at a time that's distant enough that the types of animals they're interacting with are different to the types of animals that are around today. So all those ideas were bubbling around and by the middle of the 19th century. And of course, Charles Darwin with The Origin of the Species in 1859, natural selection and the idea of evolution, all of these things sort of came together. So it's this great sort of meeting of minds and development of new ideas around the history of humanity, the history of the earth, and all these things sort of led to, well, maybe we can investigate the idea that maybe we can investigate the history of humanity through things like archaeology. Another great thing that was happening at the time was the invention of photography. So photography is often quite intimately tied up with the history of archaeology, and photography as an invention came around at about the same time as archaeology was developing, and evolution and all those other sorts of things. So the other thing that happened was we got this idea of imperial archaeology. So also during the 18th and 19th centuries, the European nations, and including, of course, the UK or England, Britain, were expanding out around the world and creating these empires. That led to a lot more stuff for people to investigate. They started to see that there were many different types of societies out there in the world, and they wanted to know how they related to each other, why they did things differently, why some were much larger and more highly stratified, more technologically advanced, and others less so. And particularly when a lot of those communities knew about each other, but they chose to take different paths. So why did all this? So I guess this prompted in the minds of many intellectuals during that imperial period that there's a lot of diversity to and be investigated around humanity. So that was an important thing too that was happening. So that was a good side, I guess, of imperial archaeology. The bad side was the fact of using archaeology, or the idea that there were differences between people, that evolution was out there, that the survival of the fittest, those sorts of ideas, that kind of supported the imperial ideas of, well, if we're strong enough to take over somebody else's country, then clearly we are the fittest, so it's fully justified in the grand scheme of things that these empires should be developed and should exist. So there was a sort of a pros and cons of that imperial period that both prompted this wonderful intellectual inquiry into the diversity of humanity, but also was used as a tool in many ways to support the imperial ambitions, for example, of the UK. So this is all happening, and around that time period as well, in the later 19th century, field techniques in archaeology were being developed. So it was interesting that, I guess perhaps because of this imperial context, many of the great sort of early professional or more organised archaeologists were military people. So we've got Pitt Rivers, who was an ex-military person, had a estate called Cranbourne Chase in southern England. He ran a lot of excavations there, very organised military type operations, and he had a really good record of developing detailed plans of what they found, both plan views, so looking down on your site, but also cross-sectional or vertical views of the different layers and structures that you go through as you excavate the site. So really detailed, well-developed archaeological techniques were appearing in this time period as well. So as we move from the 19th century into the 20th century, we start to get a little bit of an organisation of some of the different ideas, or the different ways that archaeology was run, or the sorts of questions, perhaps more correctly, the sorts of questions that archaeologists started to ask. So culture history was the first kind of interest. So how do we know the idea? So look at that Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age thing. What we want to try to do is look at a whole range of different archaeological sites, see how they're distributed across the landscape, across the world, and then look at the technology and the sort of the cultural traditions from each of those sites. So what shapes are their pots? What sort of stone tools do they make? What sort of art do they put onto their bronze objects? Do they sort of cast onto their bronze objects? Those sorts of things. And we say, well, can we organise order of events? What things came first? What things came later? So within a site we can see the layers. So the deepest things are older, the highest things are younger, so that's fine. But then we can compare from one site to the next and try and sort of link one set of layers from one site to a set of layers from another site to the set of layers another site, to try and see a big change through time, and sort of understand how things changed, what order events went in, and then how people moved across the landscape as well. So culture history, that's kind of what that sort of archaeology is all about. And you got to remember, there was no radiocarbon dating. We had no way of actually knowing the exact date of a thing unless it was sort of written down in the site somewhere. So we were trying to use the artifacts that were left behind as an index for understanding the order of events and how different communities were related to each other. Then there was this idea of past lifeways. So once people sort of got a bit sick of just putting together diagrams of space and time, and wanted to work out, how did these people live in the past? What did it mean to be a person from the Neolithic or the Paleolithic or the Bronze Age? What sort of things did people eat? How did they, what sort of technology did they have? How much time did they spend making pots as opposed to hunting, as opposed to growing wheat and barley? What sort of political relations might they have had within their communities? So here we're taking the data that we can find that was very inductive. That means drawing inferences on the basis of available data. So taking all this data that we can find from these sites, how many shells, how many fish bones do we find? what are the burial, what sort of things are included in burials, that sort of stuff. And then hopefully from that material, getting a picture of what life was like from people in the past. And so that was kind of like the beginning of the 20th century. These were the sorts of things that archaeologists were interested in: culture history and reconstructing past lifeways. Lifeways is a wonderfully American term, but I can't think of a better one at the moment, so we're sort of stuck with lifeways, I think. People started to think about, why do we do archaeology as well at this time? What's the point of it? Are we just technicians? I think a lot of people can work on archaeological projects. Quite often here in Thailand, we have a lot of volunteer people, and we employ a lot of local people who are certainly not archaeologists at all. But technically, they are incredibly good at the work that we ask people to do. So we can be very good technicians as archaeologists. We're very good at a particular process. Are we just stamp collectors? Do we just collect stuff for the interest of it? We want to find one of every type of pot that humans made in the past, perhaps. Is that what we're doing? And then, of course, Indiana Jones, the new Indiana Jones movie. This is recorded in 2024, January 2024. The new Indiana Jones movie just came out recently. There's always those Nazis. What are those Nazis doing? They're always looking for those secret things with us. Not necessarily magic, but a bit like those early state societies. They're looking to relate their culture, the modern culture, to the past, to legitimize their authority, to legitimize their right to rule, to lead the world at a particular time. So we've got to be careful as archaeologists that we're not just supporting some other political kind of agendas. There was an archaeologist, V. Gordon Childe, in the 1920s, 1930s, who really pushed the idea of using archaeology to examine social and economic relations, and really getting into the study of ancient societies, not just what they made and how it was distributed over space and time, but what were these societies like? How did they relate to each other? How did that idea of different types of societies, chiefdoms, hunters and gatherers, early state societies, different types of state societies, how did those things come about, and why did they come about? V. Gordon Childe was a very good communist, and being a communist is a way of, at least in those days, was a way of having that political ideology, was a way of sort of encouraging you to investigate these ideas of what societies were like and how they came about a little bit more deeply, perhaps. So, after the Second World War, there were a couple of things that really happened straight after the Second World War. As a result of nuclear atomic testing and development of atomic bombs and those sorts of things, radiocarbon dating was invented. So all of a sudden, we had a way of directly dating things that we dug up. So it's not as simple as it sometimes sounds, and we'll talk about that later on, but basically, in the best circumstances, we could say, here's a layer of stuff, and we can find some burnt wood, maybe some bone or some other organic material in that layer. We can directly date it, and we can say that this layer was put down 2,150 years ago. So now, instead of having to look at the order of the different types of artifacts and things to try and understand what the order of events was, we can actually directly date certain things, and then we can say, well, we know what the order of events was. Now, why was it like that? And why was it different at this site from this site over here? Why did things happen more slowly or faster or in a different order over here from what they did over there? So radiocarbon dating gave us another bit of evidence that we could now use to try and investigate and ask questions about how and why things change. And this was the beginning of a thing called processual archaeology, and sort of moving from inductive to deductive reasoning. So in this case, what people were trying to do was develop hypotheses, laws, or at least developing hypotheses. So we think that humans went from hunting and gathering to agricultural lifestyles because the environment changed at the end of the last ice age. So we come up with this idea, this hypothesis, based on some of our observations. We then go out and try and excavate, try and find new evidence that's going to help us to answer that question, to say, yes, that hypothesis, that idea is correct, or it appears to be correct, or that idea doesn't seem to be working, and we need to come up with something new and something different. So processual archaeology was a thing that came about kind of after the Second World War. It was sort of made archaeology a bit more scientific, got into these ideas of hypotheses and being more deductive, and also made use of radiocarbon dating. One of the criticisms of processual archaeology is it became too scientific, and we forgot that there were people involved. Now, not all processual archaeologists were like that, but there was a bit of a tendency within processual archaeology to forget that there were people involved, and people make decisions for all sorts of reasons, and it's often a lot more complicated than simply what was the most useful or most sensible way of doing things. So sometimes humans are more complicated. So that's the main criticism of processual archaeology, that it was a bit sciencey and a bit too reductive. So as I said, radiocarbon dating, incredibly important aspect that came about after the Second World War, changed the way that archaeology works, hugely. So really, really important. There's a great website if you want to go to the University of Oxford, UK, Archaeology and Radiocarbon website. If you look that up, you'll find all sorts of great background information about how radiocarbon dating works, why it's important, what sort of things you can do with it. It's a really, really useful site. We'll be directing to that again later on in the semester. So just talking about the dates, there's a slide here which I might get around to changing, but and the one that's up on here says in 2020 in Australia, that was 1441 on the Islamic calendar, and for Thai Buddhists it was 2563. So here as of January 2024, we're just into 2567 on the Thai Buddhist calendar. So talking about dates are relative things. Whilst radiocarbon dating is in a sense very scientific, the system that you record the dates in is something that you choose kind of culturally, I guess. So BC means before Christ, AD Anno Domini in the year of our Lord, so after Christ has been born. That's kind of the old dating system, and a lot of stuff in Southeast Asia is still talked about in the BC AD system, just because that's kind of been the tradition. People prefer to use BCE and CE. It's exactly the same dating, refers exactly the same zero date, so the zero date being the birth of Christ. So BCE is how many years before the Common Era or before Christ, and CE, the Common Era, how many years after the birth of Christ. Anno Domini, AD or CE, how many years. So it's exactly the same number, just a different set of letters after it. And the BCE and CE has been used in order to try and get rid of the idea of a Christian sort of centric way of looking at the world. But at the same time, it's still within the same system. So, of course, in Thailand, people will talk about 2567 being the amount of years since the birth of Buddha, or in fact the death of Buddha. So again, it's a system which relates to that particular religious context. So in a more radiocarbon dating has brought about different ways of thinking about it. So people now talk about BP, or before present. So that means that's how many years, how many radiocarbon years, or how many years before present, based on a radiocarbon dating system, did something occur. So BP, and that sounds all very scientific, but of course the present keeps changing. But actually in this situation it doesn't. So BP actually means before about 1950. So 1950 has been chosen because that's kind of after there was some major atomic bomb testing around the world had already happened. And so the thing that radiocarbon dating relies on had been kind of messed up in the atmosphere anyway. So we're looking at anything the years before 1950. So all of this doesn't matter that much at the moment. The main thing is to be clear when you're reading about radiocarbon dates or the dates when things happen in any of your textbooks or articles or whatever that you're reading, be clear about whether it's BC, BP, BCE or some other dating system, because it's all about that zero. What's the 0 point that the particular dating system is related to? So 2000 BP is actually about 50 AD if you think about it, or it's actually about 50 BC if you think about it. So there's about a 2,000 year difference between a BP date and a BCE or a BC date. Okay, keep that in mind. So dating is important. Once we'd sort of sorted out that archaeology needed to be a bit more scientific and we had radiocarbon dating, the next thing that happened was that after the Second World War and getting to the 60s and the 70s, human population expanded, new technologies were developing, and there was an awful lot of more ground being broken all around the world. Cities expanding, motorways being put in, new housing developments, all these sorts of things, which meant that more and more archaeological material was being discovered by accident all around the world. Battery ran flat. Okay, cultural resource management. So the idea that after the Second World War, there was a whole lot more going on in the world. Archaeological sites were being come across more and more often, and so there had to be, for at least for many parts of the world, legislation was established to make sure that those sites were at least investigated to some extent. So there was legislation, lots of stakeholders involved, and working with government agencies and private contractors, and so archaeology became a much more professional activity. So not just an academic interest, but also a professional activity related to the whole construction industry in Australia, obviously the mining industry, those sorts of areas. So here's a few images of archaeology of mining sites from the 19th century in an area of a new forestry development in New Zealand. So, archaeology becomes, as land is developed or is reused, some sort of protection or acknowledgement or recording of the archaeological resource needs to be established. So that's part of it. This is an image of one of my favourite little excavations from many, many years ago in New Zealand. And this is the back door of a small miner's cottage. It was buried, only this 10, 15 centimetres below the surface. And you can see where the red and white photo scale is. That's where the doorstep was. Little garden beds on either side at the front of the picture, a pathway leading down to the bottom of the picture there, and a little frying pan, a dog's bowl or cat bowl right beside the door as well. So when that person moved out, they just left it there, and the soil built up as the building was broken down, and this little scene, this little bit of activity was left perfectly recorded. And that was excavated as part of a modern mining archaeology, modern mining corporations' responsibilities to record the history of the area before it was destroyed by modern mining activities. So we got through processual archaeology, we got into a more professional area of archaeology. In the 1980s and coming into the 1990s, people started to say, well, there has been, archaeology is too scientific, it's too commercial, it's too unfeeling and not humanistic anymore. So it's interesting here in Australia, for example, or there in Australia, here in Australia, archaeology is in universities is a humanities subject. So it's not even a social science. So that reflects that sort of history of archaeology in the humanities. It's about humans and why humans do things and trying to understand the human species. But archaeology become quite scientific, and in some ways that had taken a little bit of that humanistic side out of it. So there's a group of archaeologists, including a very famous dude called Ian Hodder in the UK, who came up with the idea of post-processual archaeology. Post-processual archaeology came about at about the same time as postmodernism came about. So if you're doing any of the other humanities, you'll know about sort of the postmodernism there. But essentially the idea was breaking down some of the old ideas and old assumptions behind research and thinking, well, in terms of archaeology, thinking, what does let's try and think about it a little bit more from the point of view of the people whose bodies or artifacts or living areas it is that we're excavating. Let's think about it a little bit more from their point of view rather than just from the point of view of some old white men in lab coats from the Western world. So that's post-processual archaeology. The idea of that was simply to try and bring back the humanistic side of things, realize that humans don't always just make decisions for purely practical reasons. We don't decide what to grow simply because we're thinking of the most efficient thing to grow. We have a whole history and cultural traditions and other things that lie behind our decision about what to grow. So it's not just the practicalities, maybe it should be more the practicalities sometimes, but often there's a huge amount of cultural decision, cultural sort of baggage behind these things as well. So there's a lot more I could talk about post-processual archaeology. I think it's a great thing, but essentially we need a little bit of both. We need to know the science and we need to be able to think about the people themselves as well. So it's not just, humans aren't just machines that just do what, when the environment changes by 3 degrees, humans do this thing. It doesn't always happen exactly that way. So they're not just machines, but humans are also restricted by our environment. So there's certain things that we have to respond to as well. So the hermeneutic cycle or spiral, this is something I clearly don't know how to pronounce properly, but the point here is that in the past, the ways that archaeology works is often described as a circle. So we start off with some sort of observations, leads to some hypotheses. We design some excavations or some projects to try and examine those hypotheses. We then analyze the material that we found from those projects. We then compare that to our questions, see if we raise new questions, design some experiments and go around and around. And obviously with the idea of a spiral, it just shows that we are also increasing our knowledge but continuing to move along a process. It's not just one cycle and we've answered the questions. So the hermeneutics concept stresses the interaction between the presuppositions brought to the problem and the independent empirical reality of observations and experiences. So what that simply means is that when we come to examine a set of archaeological sites, we're trying to find out why did the Bronze Age become the Iron Age, for example. We come with all sorts of sort of ideas in the back of our head about why that might be. So we want to keep those very clear. We want to really be clear about what our initial ideas were, and then make sure that we can kind of not let those drive our interpretations, but be important parts of, be there. We understand our biases as we start to get into an archaeological project, and that it's only the beginning of a cycle of continual inquiry, asking new questions as we go along. Archaeology is also a community thing as well. So archaeology is not just about what we as archaeologists might find out. It's not just about responding to particular legislation that there might be in certain countries or certain parts of the world. It's also about the people who live in the places that we work. So I work here in Thailand a lot. I work with a community called Ban On Wat, a small village. You'll hear more about that later on in the course, I'm sure. But it's not that community, what does the archaeology mean to them? What do they get out of it? Why should they be interested in having these people come along and dig up their backyards to find old stuff? How can it be, what purpose does it hold for modern communities today? If there isn't a purpose for modern communities today, why should we bother doing it? Why should anybody bother paying for it? So these are all things that we might want to ask, questions we want to ask or think about. So just a few pictures from excavations. You can see in the next one that excavations are across a site, and the site is a village that is occupied today, just as it was 4,000 years ago. And the excavations go down through the soil. Underneath the village, there's been a museum built at that site, and we also continue to bring students from JCU to have homestays at this village as well, to learn more about the modern community as well as the community in the past. Okay, so I think that's almost all. Just want to finish off by saying that archaeology clearly isn't about treasure hunting. It's not about it's not a pseudo archaeology thing. So it's not. We really want to examine ideas. Ideas are great. There's all sorts of cool ideas about how things might be related in one part of the world to another. We want to examine those ideas based on the available evidence that we can find. So that's the scientific side of it. We're not just out there collecting goodies. Finding beautiful things is always amazing, but that's not the main reason we do archaeology. Archaeology is to find the context, the whole evidence, the whole lot of evidence about how people lived in the past in different places in different parts of the world, and then try and use those different individual cases from parts of the world, different times, different individuals, where we find burials and things like that, to build up a bigger picture of what life was like in the past, and use that to understand how we got to be where we are today. So we've got to be careful about treasure hunting. We've got to be careful about not going for the exciting aliens did it kind of explanation. We want to look at the evidence really carefully and see what archaeology is really what is telling us about human society in the past. And archaeology, the simplest explanation I can come up with, is the study of the human past through its material remains. So we want to understand our history as a species by looking at the things, the physical things that we've left behind. And that can be everything from these little glass beads in the middle of this picture. There's a dog skeleton there, say from a dog that was buried about 2,000 years ago in an archaeological site here in Thailand. It can be the whole landscape. So this stone wall here, which was built originally about 1,000 years ago, has been kind of maintained and modified a little bit since then, but that's part of the archaeological history of this region here as well. So archaeology is the study of the human past through its material remains. Okay, that's it for now. A little bit about the history of archaeology, why we do archaeology, and what archaeology is most concerned with. Sorry for going on for too long. I hope you like the locations. Bye.